In this lesson, we'll look at defining internal style sheets and building up CSS rules, using selectors, properties, and values. In the Chapter 3 folder, you'll find a file called hubble.htm. I'm going to open that file in my HTML editor by dragging that file onto the text edit icon, or Notepad perhaps on the PC. And when I look at the source code of this page, and I'm going to start to use source code and HTML code interchangeably, as we've seen in a previous lesson, they have the same meaning just depending on our point of view, if we're thinking as an HTML designer or if we're thinking about how the page is viewed in a web page. When I look at this source code or HTML code, I can see that there's a doc type definition at the top of the page as well as an HTML namespace, which we've seen before. But I want to point out one other item which is added here within the head element, which I'm highlighting in blue. This is a meta tag which is required for compliance with the XHTML 1.0 transitional specification. Is purely an assistance to the web browser on the other end that's looking at this web page to understand that the characters that are in this web page are Western European characters instead of 2-byte characters such as Asian language characters. But there is one other aspect of this meta tag which is significant for our purposes. If you look at the very end of this meta tag, you'll notice that after the last attribute, there's a space and a / before the closing caret. We've seen this before when we've looked at break tags. What this means is that this HTML element is what's referred to as an empty element. Notice that I'm talking about an HTML element which doesn't have something sandwiched in the middle, such as our title element, which we see immediately beneath this meta element. Notice that the title element, which I've highlighted in blue, has an opening title tag, a closing title tag, and something in between the two, in this case, some simple text. When you look at the meta tag immediately before it, that meta tag stands on its own. The opening tag and closing tag are in fact one and the same. This is what's referred to as an empty element. And this space / that occurs right before the closing caret is your hint to you that that is what this tag is. Now we can't just go and create empty elements. We have to use HTML as it's structured. But you will start to see as we get into further lessons that there are empty elements that you'll use, such as breaks, meta tags, and images, which we'll look at in the next chapter, all of which are structured as empty elements. Just something to keep in mind. These other elements that are not empty elements are referred to as block elements. They essentially represent a block of HTML code. That will become much more significant as we start to talk in depth about cascading style sheets, which we're going to get started on right now. In fact, we'll have a couple of chapters defined towards cascading style sheets and what's referred to as the box model, which allows us to treat HTML block elements as boxes and modify their layout. But we'll come back to that. For right now, we want to jump in and create our first series of cascading styles. And we're going to do that internal in this file, as opposed to creating them in a separate file and linking this file to that separate file, which is our ultimate goal and we will do in a future lesson. But for right now, position your mouse within the head element after the title element, and hit the return key on your keyboard a couple of times. I'm going to tab over and create an opening style tag. And I'm going to close that tag as soon as I finish creating it, hit the return key, and type the closing style tag, just so I don't forget to close that tag. Now I've not finished here at all. I'm going to come back up to the opening style tag and position my mouse after the E in style and hit space. And I'm going to give an attribute to this style tag. Type equals quote quote. Type is our attribute. And our value is text CSS. This is just to help the web browser understand that that which we're going to put within this style element is a series of text-based CSS rules. Now that we've created our style element, we're ready to start creating styles, which will govern the way that this web page is formatted. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to save this file, and I want to see what this file looks like in Firefox, unaltered by the activities that we're about to take. So if I open this file from the File menu by selecting File and Open, and locating from the Chapter 3 folder, hubble.htm, you can see that we have some simple text on the screen in the form of a title and some page copy. Cool photos from the Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope has captured many truly remarkable images over the last 18 years. I'm not sure which is more fantastic, that they've got these beautiful photographs or that it's been 18 years since the Hubble telescope was launched. Alright, it's the photos. Moving on. Now if I switch back over to my text editor and expand the window so I can see more of my HTML code, I'm going to start to define styles, which will govern the presentation of my HTML code. Essentially what I want to do is I want to create a rule that will change the way that all instances of heading 1s are presented. Likewise, I want to create a rule that will govern the way that all paragraph tags are presented. I'm going to clean up this paragraph tag as I'm looking at it right now. And by clean up, I mean I'd like to see that this block of text is nested within my paragraph element. I could certainly do the same thing with the H1 tag, but I don't perceive that as necessary because my heading is always very small. It's only a few words, where your paragraph element could be several paragraphs of copy. And it's a little easier to see when that copy is nested within your paragraph opening and closing tags. But up here in our style element, we're going to define our CSS rules to redefine the way that H1 and paragraph will appear in the web browser. When we work with style sheets, we need to define a selector, a property, and a value. The selector is another way of saying, what do you want to change? The property is a way of saying, what about the item that you want to change do you want to change? And the value is what you're changing things to. So, in this case, I want to redefine H1. So H1 is going to be my selector. So I'm going to type H1 without the opening and closing carets of the H1 tag. Then I'm going to type an open curly bracket. I'm going to hit the return key twice, tab over a couple of times, and type a closing curly bracket. Before I do anything else, I'm just going to look at this syntax. H1 is my selector. It's what I want to change. My CSS rules are going to be contained within the curly brackets. Now that I've set up this selector and a space into which my CSS rules will go, I'll start creating those CSS rules. Now I said a moment ago that your CSS rules are based on specifying a property that you wish to modify and the value that you'd like to pass to that property. So in this case, I want to change the color of the H1 tag, which we've seen before when we did one quick simple inline CSS style. Here I'm creating an internal CSS style. I'm not creating my CSS rules on the element that I want to change. I'm redefining the way that that element will be presented elsewhere within my HTML file, in this case within the head element. So as we had seen in a previous lesson, the property that allows us to change the color of text in CSS is color. And I'll separate my property from the value with a colon, and then I'll hit the space bar on my keyboard and type the hexadecimal value that I would like to change the color of the H1 tag to. You can retrieve hexadecimal values from the web or from almost any graphics editing program such as Photoshop. In this case, I had pre-selected a shade of blue which I thought looked nice. So I'll type in pound or hash symbol 315DCC, and then I'll type a semicolon indicating that this line of CSS rules is now complete. Now if I save this file with just this one change made, a redefinition of the way that the h1 tag should behave, and notice I haven't changed the h1 tag in my body element at all. If I switch over to my web browser and hit reload, notice that all, and in this case the only one, instance of the h1 tag has changed. But I haven't had to modify my HTML. I've only created an HTML rule, which I've put into my HTML document. Now I'll modify that rule by adding another rule. The property that allows us to govern which font is used for text in CSS is font-family, colon, and then you type the name of the font that you would like to be displayed. Now this is where we need to think about our end user. Remember, you, the web designer, probably have dozens and dozens and dozens of fonts on your machine. But remember, this HTML code is displayed by a web browser on somebody else's machine. And that person may not have all the fonts on their computer that you do. We always in the back of our mind have to consider the viewer. What do they have? You could draw an analogy with high-definition television broadcasts. Just because a digital broadcast is broadcast in high definition doesn't mean that you're seeing it in high definition if you don't have a high-definition television set. The same applies to CSS fonts. You may want to use a particular typeface, but if the viewer doesn't have it, they're not going to see it. But you can make a reasonable expectation that basic system fonts, which are common on both the Macintosh and the PC, will be present in memory. Fonts such as Verdana, Arial, Helvetica are almost always present on standard desktop computers. Now I'm also going to type sans-serif and follow that with a semicolon. The reason that I've done this is that if we look at these values in this font family rule, the order in which I type these fonts is the order in which they're going to be loaded. We mentioned in a previous lesson that HTML and CSS, for that matter, are read sequentially. The browser reads your code from the top down and from left to right. This CSS rule, font family colon, Verdana, Arial, Helvetica, sans serif, is telling the browser that's viewing this HTML page, look for Verdana. If you don't have Verdana, look for Arial. If you don't have Arial, look for Helvetica. And if you don't have Helvetica, select the default sans serif font and display the H1 tag using the default sans serif font. And if you're not sure what a sans serif font is, look over in your web browser. You'll see that before we save and apply this change, that the words cool photos from the Hubble Space Telescope are displayed in blue serif font, and the serif font gives us these little edges on the ends of the characters, such as this accent on the top of the C in the word cool. If I save this change that we just made in our HTML file from the File menu and switch over to our browser and reload, you can see that those accents are now gone. And we're now looking at Verdana for our H1. But I might decide that that text is way too big. So I'm going to add another rule to my H1 selector, and I'm going to specify a font size property set with a value to 16 pixels. If I now save my HTML document again and reload in my web browser, I can see the font is dramatically smaller. And this process of small change, switch to browser, refresh, is something you're going to do as often as drinking a cup of coffee, or at least as often as I drink a cup of coffee. So modify, save, refresh, modify, save, refresh, observe, and make changes as you go. So if I switch back over to my HTML now, I'm going to create a rule to govern the way that the paragraph tag is displayed. And I'm going to do that in similar fashion to the way that we redefined H1. I want the paragraph tag to be modified, so I'll type the paragraph tag, or P, as my selector, and then type an open curly bracket, hit return a few times on my keyboard and tab over a bit, and type a closing curly bracket, And in between these curly brackets, I'll type the rules that I want to use to redefine the appearance of all paragraph elements inside my page. And in this case, I'm going to specify rules such that the font family will also be Verdana or Arial, Helvetica, or the default sans serif font for the browser. I'll also specify a font size of 12 pixels and a font weight of normal. I also want to specify a color other than black. I want to make that text gray. So I might type color, colon, pound, 333333. I just so happen to know, because I looked up in Photoshop, that that will give us a dark shade of gray instead of black. Now if I save this file and switch over to my web browser, before I refresh I can see that Times New Roman, which is a serif font, is currently applied to this line of text. If I hit the refresh button, that text gets a little bit smaller, changes to gray, and is now formatted using Verdana, just like my opening H1 tag. And again, just like with my H1 tag, I haven't changed the HTML within the body element. All I've done is create rules which are overriding the default appearance of my HTML and making those elements appear the way I'd like them to appear.